Um, to a large extent, when the Chinese government talks about the global architecture, it's explicitly or implicitly about the United States. The United States has been and still is the most powerful country and has written most rules for the international architecture. The Chinese know that. The United States has military bases and defense obligations in China's neighborhood, so the Chinese feel it in a very physical sense. Also because China is a latecomer in the international organizations, they have to study these rules under the watchful eyes of the United States. So much of China's discourse on the multipolar world was not taken that seriously by the United States until very recently. People tended to dismiss that as merely rhetoric with a good reason, because the Chinese government has been trying very hard to expand economic and cultural ties with the United States, and it still has to deal with issues more on America's terms than China. Of course, what's happened now is that China is on the rise, and some other countries such as Brazil and India are also rising. And as a result, China has become more assertive. And the US is also taking China more seriously, and they're also paying attention, almost anticipating China's tough position on certain issues. But the question is, what the Chinese are assertive about? And so far, the Chinese position is that they have been mainly assertive about what they consider to be China's core national interests, which are essentially Taiwan, Tibet, human rights, etc. And of course, as observers, you can see that what China defines as core national interests have expanded to some extent in scope, and much of the focus is on the manner by which they are trying to defend those interests. What's interesting here is that it mainly reflected in China's relations with the United States and with some countries. I'm not sure whether that assertiveness is reflected in China's relations with Brazil or other countries. I doubt it very much, because I don't see any reason. From the Chinese perspective, this is not about being assertive, but about adhering to its principles. Actually, this is what the Chinese government said recently, a few weeks ago, at the National People's Congress meeting earlier this month. Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi was asked about this by American journalists. As a background, in the United States, in recent weeks and months, there have been media reports about China's greater assertiveness, and particularly in Copenhagen and elsewhere. So Yang answered that China's core national interests are in the three documents between the Chinese government and the United States, and the U.S. should know those principles. And again, he emphasized that China is adhering to its principled positions rather than just being assertive. And Mr. Yang's speech made it very clear from China's perspective, it is merely defending its own interests. Of course, for scholars who study Chinese foreign policy, and they have observed that the Chinese government often perceives its foreign policy fundamentally from a defensive perspective. And of course, what China considers to be defensive is not always shared by other countries. That's part where sometimes the disputes take place. Right now, what we can see is that when it comes to international global architecture, what is interesting to me is actually China has been rather passive. I don't know if anyone here can name a single major initiative by the Chinese government about any new institution or major adaptation of an institution. The answer is no, they haven't. They have been, it's clear that the Chinese government is being asked to do this and that, but they haven't come out with many new initiatives. This is kind of interesting. You can argue that part of this is that, again, China is changing very fast. China has all these domestic problems. It can be a confusing time for people to think through all these things. I heard this morning and this afternoon, it seems that some people in Brazil feel that there was lots of confusion about what Brazil has to do. people seem to think China knows what it wants to do. Based on what I hear, no, and they're still debating. The other reason is that fundamentally, this is also probably reflect the fact that China is basically happy, happy about the current architecture. At least they are not upset enough to try to change it. Clearly, China can see the possibility of adjusting its place in the existing architecture. To some extent, the U.S. actually wants to adjust China's position even faster than China wants to do. I'll come back to that point. And there's certainly room. The question is that if your position rises in the Internet organization, what are you going to do about it? What does that mean? What kind of obligations? That's where the issue is. So if you look at China's very cautious position, it's not surprising for people who study China. When it comes to major decisions, China actually moves relatively slowly. This is reflected in its domestic decision-making process. They have to form some sort of consensus and work through things. But once it makes up its mind, it tends to actually move pretty fast. I think they're still in that process of thinking through all this. The other reason is also domestic, because this is the reform era for China. The way Chinese government has been implementing its reform is gradualism and experimentalism. So you can say that that's being reflected in its foreign policy. They're also trying to be gradualist and experiment with different issue areas and see how it goes. And obviously, this is for China's own national interest, want to minimize costs and maximize gains. And of course, this is from Beijing's perspective. From the perspective of the United States and some other major powers, what actually matters is that China, being who it is, will constitute a reshaping force for the global architecture, whatever its policy declaration or whether you have a strategy or not. Just by being there, just being, who they are, and it's going to have an impact on the global architecture. And this is where sometimes the two sides talk past each other, in actual discussions. So if you follow, if I move down to the actual policy debates in China about China's role in the world, there was no question that there was a greater degree of assertiveness, and then was reflected in the government policy. And there are lots of people who want the Chinese government to be even stronger in defending what they view as China's core national interests, and particularly vis-a-vis the United States. The argument is often, we have been lending them $1 trillion, and then what's the point? And they are pressuring us, then you should retaliate. Of course, the moderate will argue that would be they wouldn't use the term silliest thing you can do, but essentially, that's what it is, right? It's mutually destructive. Anyone who has done economic 101 would understand, and what that would mean. To come to the global, the actual institution, China does not like the Group 2 idea. And when the U.S. first sort of toyed with the idea, and from think tankers, from former government officials, and by the way, there was great communication between the United States and China, and they know exactly, what they're doing. There are all these channels and going back and forth, and the Chinese government did not like it that much. They actually said so publicly. The discussion within China is actually sharper. This is not about modesty, and if you think about it, if you truly are ambitious, I want to be a great power, you can say, this is your opportunity. G2, great, and you'll be, at least number 2. Part of the reason why people in China do not like the G2 idea, from both sides, people don't like it. Nationalists feel that all this pressure on China taking on greater responsibility is really a trap by the West.